There is a photograph from 1869 that almost nobody has seen, and it is the photograph that explains the Wild West more honestly than every gunfight ever filmed. It shows a man in a coffin. He's wearing a wool suit. His eyes are closed. His hands are folded across his chest. He looks about 30. He looks asleep. He's not asleep. He has been dead for 9 days. The photographer who took the picture, a man named Cassius Clay Bergs, working out of a rented room above a hardware store in Atchison, Kansas, charged the family $4 for the sitting, $2 extra for the colored tinting, and another $1 for the silk and linen inner lining of the coffin that appears in the foreground. He delivered the finished cabinet card on a Tuesday, 2 weeks after the burial, and the family used it as the centerpiece of their parlor for the next 20 years. The original print is in a collection in Topeka. The family is gone. The parlor is gone. The man in the coffin has a name in the record, but the name is not the point. The point is what the photograph was for. The point is that the photograph was the only thing the family had left. Stay with me, because the man in the coffin is not the strangest part of this story. The strangest part is the man who took the picture, and the man who came after him, and the entire industry that grew up around photographing the dead in the American West between 1865 and 1895, an industry that, at its peak, employed more people per capita in Kansas and Missouri than the railroad did, that developed a vocabulary of poses and props that has not changed in 150 years, and that, when the Kodak flexible roll film arrived in 1888, was forced to invent an entirely new reason to exist. By the time this story ends, you are going to understand 3 things you almost certainly do not know right now. The first is that the post-mortem photograph was not invented in the Victorian era. It was invented in 1840, 2 years after the daguerreotype. A Boston daguerreotypist named Josiah Hawes was asked by a friend to make a portrait of his dead son. The friend wanted a record. The friend wanted proof that the boy had existed. Hawes took the picture. The picture is in the Boston Athenaeum. The boy is in the boy's grave. The proof is still there. The second thing you are going to understand is that the practice in the American West became something different from what it was in New England. In the East, the post-mortem portrait was a private grief, made in the family home, shown only to relatives. In the West, it was a public event, made in the photographer's studio, shown to anyone who walked through the door. The difference is the difference between a memorial and an advertisement. The West built the advertisement, and the advertisement was the largest unregulated industry of its kind in the United States. The third thing, and this is the part that is going to sit with you after the video is over, is that the man in the photograph from 1869 is not alone. There are tens of thousands of him. There are post-mortem portraits of children in the Smithsonian, of mothers in the New York Historical Society, of cowboys in the Amon Carter Museum, of soldiers in the National Archives, of miners in the Bancroft Library. Some are named, most are not. The photographers are named more often than the dead, because the photographer signed the cabinet card, and the dead did not. That is the thing the Wild West would rather you not think about. It is also the thing the Wild West is most honest about, if you are willing to look. Hollis Vance took his first post-mortem portrait in the spring of 1869 in a town called Ellsworth, Kansas, that no longer exists. He was 24. He had been a portrait photographer for less than 3 years. He had learned the craft from a man in Leavenworth, who had learned it from a man in St. Louis, who had learned it from a daguerreotypist who had toured New England in 1848. The lineage was short, and the craft was new. And the people who knew how to do it were fewer than you would expect for something that everybody in the West was going to need, eventually, whether they wanted to or not. Hollis did not intend to photograph the dead. He had set up his studio above the dry goods store to make portraits of the living. The living paid better. The living tipped. The living came back the next year with a new baby and bought a second cabinet card for the grandmother in Ohio. The dead, in Hollis's experience, were the photograph nobody wanted to take and everybody, eventually, was going to need. The call came on a Tuesday morning. A man Hollis did not know came up the stairs of the dry goods store, breathing hard, and asked if Hollis could come to the Leland boarding house, 2 blocks down, and bring his camera. Hollis asked who had died. The man said his daughter. Hollis asked how old. The man said 6. Hollis asked if the body had been prepared. The man said yes, that morning. Hollis asked if the family had a particular pose. The man said they would trust Hollis to know. Hollis packed the camera. He carried it across the dusty street, the wooden case banging against his thigh, the brass lens cap warm from sitting in the morning sun on the windowsill. The boarding house was a 2-story frame building, whitewashed with a porch that ran the full width of the front. The body of the girl was laid out in the parlor on a card table covered with a sheet. The family, the father, the mother, an older sister who was perhaps 12, stood against the far wall, not looking at the body, looking at the floor. Hollis set up the camera. He adjusted the plate holder. He asked the mother if she would like to hold the girl's hand in the picture. The mother said no. The mother said the picture was for the grandmother in Ohio, and the grandmother in Ohio had never seen the girl alive, and the grandmother in Ohio would not need to see the hand. Hollis understood. He took the picture. The exposure was 11 seconds. The girl did not move. The family wanted one photograph, one cabinet card, one object that could be mailed across the country to a woman who would never meet her granddaughter and would have, for the rest of her life, exactly this one image. Hollis delivered the cabinet card on Thursday. He charged $3. The family paid without comment. It was not the most expensive photograph Hollis had ever taken. It was not the most difficult. It was, however, the one that taught him what the work actually was. He was not, he understood that afternoon, in the business of making art. He was not in the business of making a record. He was in the business of building a small, portable, mail-able proof that a person had been alive and that the people who loved the person had loved them. The proof did not have to be beautiful. The proof had to exist. That was the entire job. That was the entire industry. What the industry became between 1869 and 1895 is a story that has been told in pieces by collectors, by curators, by the people who put the photographs in museums and the small printed cards beside them that explain what the visitor is looking at. The small printed cards almost never explain what the visitor is actually looking at. What the visitor is actually looking at is a profession that, for 30 years, was the most important job in the American West that nobody talked about. But here is the detail that makes the practice of death photography in the American West different from anything that came before it, in New England or in France. The detail is the door. In Boston, in 1840, the post-mortem portrait was made in the parlor of the family home. The daguerreotypist came to the house. He set up his equipment in the room where the body had been laid out. The picture recorded the family in its grief, the way the family actually looked. The picture could not be shown to anyone who had not been invited, because everyone in it was identifiable, and the only reason to take the picture in the house was that the family wanted the picture to record the house. In Ellsworth, Kansas, in 1869, the body was brought to the photographer. That is the difference. In the East, the photographer went to the body. In the West, the body came to the photographer. The reason had nothing to do with grief, and everything to do with the fact that the West did not yet have the infrastructure to support grief inside the home. There was, in most Western towns of 1869, no parlor large enough for a camera. The houses were one-room cabins, sometimes two with a single window. The laying out happened in the front room, in front of the children, in front of the neighbors who came to sit with the family for the 3 days the custom required. The rooms smelled, by the second day, of lye soap and flowers, and the slow, sweet work of a body releasing what bodies release. The photographer could not set up a camera there. The family did not want him there. The picture, if it was to be made, had to be made somewhere else. Somewhere else was the studio. Hollis's studio in Ellsworth was a single room on the second floor of the dry goods store, 12 feet by 16 feet, a north-facing window for the light, a plain wooden chair on a platform, a painted backdrop of a column and a curtain, a small wooden stand that held a vase of artificial flowers, and a curtain that could be pulled across the corner of the room to create a small private space behind which the family could wait. The studio smelled, on a normal day, of developing chemicals and the dust that came in through the window from Front Street. On the days Hollis was photographing the dead, the studio smelled, in addition, of the powder the undertaker had used and the camphor the family had packed around the body for the transport from house to studio. The dead came to the studio in a wagon. The family came with the body. The undertaker came. Because the undertaker was the man who owned the wagon. The photographer waited on the sidewalk for the wagon to pull up. The body was carried up the stairs. The family followed. The curtain was drawn. The photographer did what the family could not do, which was to make a small, calm, well-lit object out of the largest grief the family had ever experienced. The price structure was, in its way, more honest than the price structure of almost any other trade in the West. The base price in 1872 was $3 to $5, including the sitting, the exposure, the development, the cabinet card, and a single print. Additional prints were 50 cents. Color tinting was $2 extra. A second body in the same sitting, a mother and child who had died in the same epidemic, was an additional $3. Props were charged separately. A Bible in the hand of the deceased was $1. A bouquet was 50 cents. A wreath was $2 because the wreath had to be ordered from the florist in the next town and shipped in by rail. The prices were not negotiable. The families paid. The families had, in many cases, just spent everything they had on the doctor, the undertaker, the coffin, the plot, the headstone. The cabinet card was the last expense, and the family treated it the way a person treats the last expense of a long project. They paid it because not paying it would have meant that the project had no final object. The parlor object. That is what the postmortem cabinet card was. It was the parlor object for a culture that had lost, in the move west, most of the other parlor objects an Eastern family would have had. There was no inherited silver. There was no portrait of the grandmother. There was no painting over the mantel, because there was no mantel. The cabinet card of the dead, displayed on a small wooden stand on a side table in the front room, was the only piece of evidence that the family had ever had a member who had died. Without it, the death was a story. With it, the death was a fact. Hollis made a good living. He made a better living than most of the men in Ellsworth, including the owner of the dry goods store below his studio. The work was steady. People died in the winter, when the houses were cold and the pneumonia came in. People died in the summer when the cholera came upriver from New Orleans. People died in the spring when the dust brought the diphtheria. People died in the fall when the children went back to school. The seasons of the West were also the seasons of the dead, and the seasons of the dead were the seasons of the cabinet card. Hollis photographed on average between 4 and 6 dead people a month. 4 to 6 a month, for the 10 months a year that the weather allowed a body to be transported, was 40 to 60 dead people a year. Hollis did this for 26 years. He photographed, by the time he stopped in 1895, more than 1,000 dead people. He had names for perhaps 300. The other 700 were strangers, brought to him by an undertaker who did not always know the family and sometimes did not know the dead either. This is the part of the story that the museums do not like to talk about. The museums like the cabinet card with the name, the cabinet card with the biography, the cabinet card with a small printed card beside it that says, Lillian May Hargrove, age 4, died of diphtheria, photographed by Hollis Vance, Ellsworth, Kansas, March 1873. The museums do not know what to do with the cabinet cards that do not have a name. Hollis photographed those too. He charged the undertaker the same price. The undertaker kept the cabinet cards in a desk drawer because the undertaker was the only person with any legal claim to the effects of a man who had died without a family. The cabinet cards accumulated. When the undertaker retired in 1889, the cabinet cards went to the county courthouse because the courthouse was where abandoned property went. The cabinet cards are in the courthouse today. The names on the backs of them are not names. They are descriptions. Unknown man, Red Front Hotel, July 1877. Unknown woman, found in railroad yard, October 1879. 2 children, believed to be brother and sister, age approximately 6 and 8. Parents, unknown. The cabinet cards are in a box in the basement of the courthouse. The box has not been opened in 40 years. Here is what you are looking at when you look at one of those cabinet cards. You are looking at the only portrait the person ever had. You are looking at the only proof that the person ever lived. And you are looking at it because a man in a rented room in a Kansas town did his job in 1877, without being asked to do it well, and without being paid to do it with love, and without being told the name of the man in the coffin, and without thinking, on the day he took the picture, that the picture would still exist 148 years later, in a basement, in a box, in a courthouse, in a town that still has not decided what to do with the box. That is the first half of the story. The second half is about what happened when the practice stopped being a single photographer with a single camera and started being an industry. The first hint that the practice was about to change came not from a photographer but from an undertaker. His name was Samuel Tate. He ran the only undertaking parlor in Abilene, Kansas in 1871, and he had a ledger. The ledger, in the Kansas Historical Society today, records every family Tate served, every coffin he sold, every plot he arranged, and every photograph made of the dead in his parlor. There were, on average, 3 such photographs a year in Abilene between 1862 and 1870. In 1871, there were 11. In 1872, there were 23. In 1873, there were 40. The death rate in Abilene was roughly constant. The increase came because Tate had figured out, in the late summer of 1870, that he could charge the family for the photograph as part of the overall funeral expense, and that the family would accept the charge more readily if it appeared on the same invoice as the coffin and the plot. The photograph became, in the language of the trade, a line item. That sounds like a small thing. It was not. It was the moment the practice stopped being something a photographer did for a family and started being something an undertaker sold to a family. The photographer was still the man with the camera. The undertaker was now the man with the customer. The undertaker decided which photographer the family used. The undertaker decided whether the photograph was taken at all. The undertaker decided, in many cases, the pose, the props, the framing, and the tinting. The undertaker collected the money, paid the photographer a fixed fee, and kept the difference. Hollis, in Ellsworth, had worked directly for the family. The family had walked up the stairs, paid him at the desk, and carried the cabinet card home in a paper sleeve. The family owned the picture. By 1875, in Abilene and Dodge City and Wichita and every other cattle town of any size, the family did not choose the photographer. The family chose the undertaker. The undertaker chose the photographer. The deal was that the undertaker would direct all his post-mortem work to the photographer, and the photographer would pay the undertaker a referral fee of $1 per sitting. The dollar came out of the family's payment. The family did not know about the dollar. This is the moment the industry became an industry. It is also the moment the industry stopped being honest. The family was no longer the customer. The undertaker was the customer. The undertaker's interest was not in making the most accurate record of the dead person. The undertaker's interest was in selling a service package the family would not, in their grief, disassemble. The arrangement also produced, by 1878, an entire vocabulary of poses and props that had not existed in 1869. The vocabulary was not invented by the photographers. The vocabulary was invented by the undertakers because the undertakers were the men talking to the families, and the families were asking the undertakers what the photograph was supposed to look like. The vocabulary included the deceased laid out on a bed, the head propped on a pillow, the eyes closed, the deceased seated in a chair, the hands folded in the lap, the deceased standing against a wall supported by a relative behind, the deceased being held by a parent, the parent's hand behind the body to keep it upright, the deceased as an infant wrapped in a christening gown, sometimes borrowed from the undertaker's stock and reused for the next infant who died, the deceased in a coffin, the lid open, the head on a silk pillow, the hands folded across the chest, the coffin lined with white cotton, or, for an extra fee, silk. The vocabulary was not regional. It was not ethnic. It was the same in Kansas as in Virginia, the same in California as in New York, the same in a Mexican-American community in San Antonio, as in a Yankee community in Des Moines. The vocabulary was the industry's product. The vocabulary held for 30 years. It held through the introduction of the Kodak camera in 1888, which made it possible for a family to take its own post-mortem photograph at home, and which made the studio portrait feel suddenly old-fashioned. It held through the Spanish-American War of 1898, which produced the first mass casualty post-mortem photography under government direction, with the Army arranging the dead in rows and the Army photographers taking the pictures for the families back home. The The vocabulary held into the 20th century in a diluted form in the funeral home portrait that an American family could still, in 1955, order from the funeral director as part of the overall service. The vocabulary held because the families did not know it was a vocabulary. The families thought it was the way the dead looked in photographs. The families had been taught to think this by the sample book, by the undertaker, by the photographer, who had been taught to think it by the previous photographer, who had been taught to think it by a daguerreotypist in Boston in 1840, who had taken a picture of a friend's son and had not known, on the day he took the picture, that the picture he was taking would still be the picture in 1955, that American families would think of when they thought of how the dead were supposed to look in photographs. The picture in 1955 looked almost exactly like the picture in 1840. The vocabulary had held. The industry had done its work. The work was, in a way the industry had not planned, more permanent than the people in the pictures. The sample book is how the vocabulary became standardized. The sample book is also how the vocabulary became impossible to escape. A family in 1878 who wanted a post-mortem portrait that did not look like the cabinet cards in the sample book had to insist in a way most grieving families did not have the energy to insist, or find a photographer who had not been shown the sample book, which by 1878 was almost no one. But here is the part of the story that does not make it into the sample book, the part that does not make it into the museum display, or the curatorial essay, or the academic paper on the iconography of American mourning. Hollis's wife died in March of 1879 in Ellsworth of the same fever that had killed the undertaker's daughter 10 years earlier. Her name was Ada. She was 31. She had been pregnant. The baby, a boy, was stillborn. The doctor wrote in his casebook that the death was a loss we could not prevent and a suffering we could not shorten. Hollis took the photograph. The photograph is in a private collection in Lawrence, Kansas. It has been exhibited twice, both times under a title that did not name Ada. The first exhibit called the Cabinet Card, Untitled Portrait, Kansas, 1879. The second called it Mourning Portrait, attributed to Hollis Vance. The first title is the honest one. Hollis took the photograph on a Thursday in his studio, 2 days after Ada died. The body had been prepared by the same undertaker who had brought him his first post-mortem sitting in 1869. The undertaker did not charge Hollis for the preparation. The undertaker sent a bill for $7, the standard rate for a sitting. Hollis paid it. The two men did not speak about the bill. The cabinet card was delivered in a paper sleeve on a Saturday. Hollis did not display the cabinet card. He did not show it to the neighbors who came to sit with him for the 3 days the custom required. He kept it in a drawer of his desk, in the studio, in a leather envelope that had been made for a different cabinet card, and that did not quite fit. The envelope was too long by an inch. The cabinet card slid up and down inside the envelope when the drawer was opened. The sliding made a small sound. The sound was, for the rest of Hollis's working life, the sound of opening that drawer. The boy was not photographed. Hollis did not photograph the boy because the boy had not, in Hollis's understanding, lived. The cabinet card was, in Hollis's working philosophy, a proof that a person had existed. The boy had not existed. The boy had been born into a world he had not been given the chance to perceive. The boy had no face anyone had seen. The boy had no name Hollis had given him because Hollis and Ada had not agreed on a name, the disagreement being one of the small domestic negotiations that had occupied the last months of the pregnancy, and that had been, like most of the small domestic negotiations of a marriage, more important at the time than either of them had understood. Hollis lived another 16 years. He never remarried. He continued to photograph the dead of Ellsworth and the cattle towns to the west. He continued to make a good living. He did not, in the years after 1879, take a post-mortem portrait of an infant. He refused them. The refusal cost him work. The work went to photographers in neighboring towns who did not have the same compunction. Hollis did not, as far as the records show, regret the refusal. He simply informed the families who came to him that he did not photograph infants, and that he could recommend a photographer in the next town who would, and the families went, and the cabinet card was made, and the family had what the family needed. The drawer in the desk still had Ada's cabinet card. The envelope still did not quite fit. The cabinet card still slid up and down when the drawer opened. Here is what I think is the most honest thing to say about Hollis Vance and about the men and women who did this work. In Ellsworth and Abilene and Dodge City and Wichita and Tombstone and Deadwood and every other town in the American West where a man with a camera could be hired to make a small, calm, well-lit object out of a family's largest grief. They were not artists. They were not documentarians. They were, in most cases, people who had no particular feeling about death beyond the practical feeling of someone who had seen a great deal of it. They were craftsmen. They did a job. The job was, in the language of the trade, to make the last portrait. The last portrait was not, for the family, the most important object in the house. The last portrait was, in many cases, the only object in the house that was going to be left. The families understood this. The photographers understood this. The vocabulary the undertakers and photographers had built together, the pillow, the chair, the silk lining, the eyes closed, the hands folded, was the vocabulary the families used to think about death. The vocabulary held because it was the only vocabulary anyone had been given. The man in the photograph from 1869 in Atchison, Kansas, in the cabinet card that almost nobody has seen. He was not Cassius Clay Burke's only subject. Cassius Clay Burke made, between 1868 and 1882, more than 400 post-mortem cabinet cards. The names of approximately 120 are in the historical record. The other 280 are not. The 280 are in a different box, in a different basement, in a different courthouse, in a different Kansas town. The 280 are waiting for someone to decide what to do with them. The 280 are the reason this story is not over. The story ends where it began. In 1895, Hollis Vance closed his studio in Ellsworth, packed his camera in its wooden case, and moved to Wichita to live with his brother's family. He was 50. He had photographed the dead for 26 years. He had made more than 1,000 cabinet cards, charged somewhere near $5,000 in fees, and consumed an unknown but considerable quantity of plate glass, developing chemicals and the patience of families who had asked him to take a picture of the worst day of their lives. He did not take his own photograph when he died, in 1909, of the same fever that had killed Ada. His nephew, who had been a child when Hollis had moved into the family home, took a single portrait of the body in the parlor of the brothers' house. The nephew was not a professional. The portrait was a tintype, made with a kit he had bought from a hardware store. The tintype is in the same private collection in Lawrence. It is filed in the index under Hollis Vance, Post-Mortem, 1909, Attributed. The word attributed is doing a great deal of work. The word means the curator is not certain the tintype is a portrait of Hollis Vance. The word means the curator is not certain who made the tintype. The word means the curator is not certain whether the man in the tintype is dead or alive, because the tintype is, like most tintypes of the period, slightly out of focus, and the eyes are, in the way of all tintypes of the period, slightly too bright. Hollis would have known. Hollis would have looked at the tintype and said, in the language of the trade, the eyes are wrong, or the hands are right, or the chin is the chin. Hollis is not here to look at the tintype. The tintype is in the collection. The collection is in the museum. The museum is in Kansas. Kansas is the place where the post-mortem portrait was made into an industry, and the vocabulary, and the parlor object. The 280 cabinet cards of Cassius Clay Burke are in a box in a basement. The cabinet cards of Hollis Vance are in 3 places: a drawer in a museum in Topeka, a private collection in Lawrence, and a cardboard box in the studio of a man in Ellsworth who bought the building in 1923 and who has, in his own words, never had the heart to throw out what was in the desk. The cabinet cards are waiting the way the families waited in 1869, in 1879, and 1895 for someone to come up the stairs with a camera and a willingness to do the work. The vocabulary is still here. The undertaker still has the sample book. The family still has the parlor. The parlor object is still the only proof. The proof is still there. If you made it this far, thank you. You stayed for all of it. Now I want to ask you something, and I want you to answer honestly in the comments. Out of everything I just told you, the cabinet card from 1869, the parlor object, the vocabulary that held for 30 years, the box in the basement, what is the single detail that is going to stay with you? Not the most important one, The one that surprised you most? Drop it below. I read every one of these, and the answers shape the next episode. And if this is the kind of history you want more of, the part the posters never showed, the work that was done in rooms nobody talked about, subscribe. The next episode is about a man whose real job was something else entirely, and whose name is in every textbook, and who almost certainly did not do the thing the textbook says he did. The story is going to be darker than you expect, and it is going to be true.